Hi viewers, welcome to the Grammar Channel. The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. Chapter 9. Listening to Chapter 9. In the Witch's House. And now, of course, you want to know what had happened to Edmund. He had eaten his share of the dinner, but he hadn't really enjoyed it because he was thinking all the time about Turkish delight. And there is nothing that spoils the taste of good ordinary food half so much as the memory of bad magic food. And he had heard the conversation and hadn't enjoyed it much either because he kept on thinking that the others were taking no notice of him and trying to give him the cold shoulder. They weren't, but he imagined. And then he had listened until Mr. Beaver told them about Aslan and until he had heard the whole arrangement for meeting Aslan at the stone table. It was then that he began very quietly to edge himself under the curtain which hung over the door. For the mention of Aslan gave him a mysterious and horrible feeling, just as it gave the others a mysterious and lovely feeling. Just as Mr. Beaver had been repeating the rhyme about Adam's flesh and Adam's bone, Edmund had been very quietly turning the door handle. And just before Mr. Beaver had begun telling them that the white witch was not really human at all, but half a jinn and half a giantess, Edmund had got outside into the snow, cautiously closed the door behind him. You mustn't think that even now Edmund was quite so bad that he actually wanted his brothers and sisters to be turned into stone. He didn't want Turkish delight and to be a prince and later a king and to pay Peter out for calling him a beast. As for what the witch would do with the others, he did not want her to be particularly nice to them, certainly not to put them on the same level as himself. But he managed to believe or to pretend he believed that she wouldn't do anything very bad to them because he said to himself, all these people who say nasty things about her are her enemies, and probably half of it is not true. She was jolly nice to me anyway, but nicer than they are, much nicer than they are. I expect she is the rightful queen, really. Anyway, she'll be better than that awful Aslan. At least that was the excuse he made in his own mind for what he was doing. It wasn't a very good excuse, however, for deep down inside him, he really knew that the White Witch was bad and cruel. The first thing he realized when he got outside and found the snow falling all around him was that he had left his coat behind in the beaver's house. And of course, there was no chance of going back to get it now. The next thing he realized was that the daylight was almost gone, for it had been nearly 3 o'clock when they sat down to dinner and the winter days were short. He hadn't reckoned on this, but he had to make the best out of it. So he turned up his collar, shuffled across the top of the dam. Luckily, it was not so slippery since the snow had fallen, to the far side of the river. It was pretty bad when he reached the far side. It was growing darker every minute, and what with that and the snowflakes swirling all around him, he could hardly see 3 feet ahead. Then, too, there was no road. He kept slipping into deep drifts of snow and skidding on frozen puddles and tripping over fallen tree trunks, sliding down steep banks, barking his shins against rocks till he was wet and cold and bruised all over. The silence and the loneliness were dreadful. In fact, I really think he might have given up the whole plan and gone back and owned up and made friends with the others if he had not happened to say to himself, when I am king of Narnia, the first thing I shall do will be to make some decent roads. And of course, that set him off thinking about being a king and all the other things he would do, and this cheered him to be with a good deal. He had just settled in his mind what sort of palace he would have, and how many cars, and all about his private cinema, and where the principal railways would run, and what laws he would make against beavers and dams, and was putting the finishing touches to some schemes for keeping Peter in his place when the weather changed. First, the snow stopped. Then a wind sprang up. It became freezing cold. Finally, the clouds were rolled away, the moon came out. It was a full moon day, and shining on all that snow, it made everything almost as bright as a day. Only the shadows were rather confusing. He would never have found his way if the moon had not come out by the time he got to the other river. You remember he had seen when they first arrived at the beaver's house, a smaller river flowing into the great one lower down. He now reached this and turned to follow it up. But the little valley down which it came was much steeper, rockier than the one he had just left, and much overgrown with bushes, so that he could not have managed it at all in the dark. Even as it was, he got wet because he had to stoop under branches, and great loads of snow came sliding off onto his back. Every time this happened, he thought more and more how he hated Peter, just as if all this had been Peter's fault. But last, he came to a part where it was more level and the valley opened out. And there, on the other side of the river, quite close to him, in the middle of a little plain between two hills, he saw what must be the White Witch's house. And the moon was shining brighter than ever. The house was really a small castle. It seemed to be all towers, little towers with long pointed spires on them, sharp as needles. They looked like huge dunces' caps or circus caps, and they shone in the moonlight. Their long shadows looked strange on the snow. Edmund began to be afraid of the house, but it was too late to think of turning back. He crossed the river on the ice and walked up to the house. There was nothing stirring, not the slightest sound anywhere. Even his own feet made no noise on the deep, newly fallen snow. He walked on and on and on, past corner after corner of the house, and past turret after turret to find the door. He had to go right round to the far side before he found it. It was a huge arch, but the great iron gate stood wide open. Edmund crept up to the arch and looked inside into the courtyard, and there he saw a sight that nearly made his heart stop beating. Just inside the gate, with the moonlight shining on it, stood an enormous lion, crouched as if it was ready to spring. Edmund stood in the shadow of the arch, afraid to go on and afraid to go back, with his knees knocking together. He stood there so long that his teeth would have been chattering with cold, even if they had not been chattering with fear. How long this really lasted, I don't know, but it seemed to Edmund to last for hours. Then, at last, he began to wonder why the lion was standing so still, for it had not moved 1 inch since he first set eyes on it. Edmund now ventured a little nearer, still keeping in the shadow of the arch as much as he could. He now saw from the way the lion was standing that it could not have been looking at him at all. But suppose it turns its head, thought Edmund. Suppose it turns its head, what will I do? In fact, it was staring at something else, namely a little dwarf who stood with his back to it about 4 feet away. Aha, thought Edmund. When it springs at the dwarf, then will be my chance to escape. But still the lion never moved, nor did the dwarf. But now, at last, Edmund remembered what the others had said about the white witch turning people into stone. Perhaps this was only a stone lion, and as soon as he had thought of that, he noticed that the lion's back and the top of its head were covered with snow. Of course, it must be only a statue. No living animal would have let itself get covered with snow. Very slowly, With his heart beating as if it would burst, Edmund ventured to go up to the lion. Even now, he hardly dared to touch it, but at last he put out his hand very quickly, and he did. It was a cold stone. He had been frightened of a mere statue. The relief which Edmund felt was so great. In spite of the cold, he suddenly got warm all over, right down to his toes. At the same time, there came into his head what seemed a perfectly lovely idea. Probably, he thought, this is the great lion Aslan that they were all talking about. She's caught him already and turned him into stone. So that is the end of all their fine ideas about him. Phew, who's afraid of Aslan? And he stood there gloating over the stone lion. Presently, he did something very silly and childish. He took a stump of lead pencil out of his pocket and scribbled a mustache on the lion's upper lip, then a pair of spectacles on his eyes. Then he said, "Yeah, silly old Aslan, how do you like being a stone? You thought yourself mighty fine, didn't you?" But in spite of the scribbles on it, the face of the great stone beast still looked so terrible, sad and noble, staring up in the moonlight. Edmund did not really get any fun out of jeering at it. He turned away, began to cross the courtyard. As he got into the middle of it, he saw that there were dozens of statues all about, standing here and there, rather than the pieces of standing on a chessboard when it is halfway through the game. There were stone satyrs and stone wolves, bears and foxes, and cat and mountains of snow. There were lovely stone shapes that looked like women, but who were really the spirits of trees. There was the great shape of a centaur and a winged horse, long, lich creature that Edmund took to be a dragon. They all looked so strange, standing there perfectly lifelike and also perfectly still. In the bright, cold moonlight, it was the airy work crossing the courtyard. Right in the very middle stood a huge shape like a man, but as tall as a tree, with a fierce face, shaggy beard, great club in its right hand. Even though he knew that it was only a stone giant and not a live one, Edmund did not like going past it. He now saw that there was a dim light showing from a doorway on the far side of the courtyard. He went to it. There was a flight of stone steps going up to an open door. Edmund went up to them. Across the threshold lay a great wolf. It's all right, he kept saying to himself. It's only a stone wolf. It cannot hurt me. He raised his leg to step over it. Instantly, the huge creature rose, with all the hair bristling along its back, opened a great red mouth, and said in a growling voice, "Who is there? Who is there? Stand still, stranger. Tell me who you are." "If you please, sir," said Edmund, trembling so that he could hardly speak. "My name is Edmund. I am the son of Adam that Her Majesty met in the wood the other day. I have come to bring her the news that my brothers and sisters are now in Narnia, quite close, in the beaver's house. She wanted to see them." "I will tell Her Majesty," said the wolf. "Meanwhile, stand still on the threshold, as you value your life." Then it vanished into the house. Edmund stood and waited, his fingers aching with cold and his heart pounding in his chest. Presently, the grey wolf, Maugrim, the chief of Witch's secret police, came bounding back and said, "Come on in, come on, fortunate favorite of the queen, or else not so fortunate." And Edmund went in, taking great care not to tread on the wolf's paws. He found himself in a long, gloomy hall with many pillars, full, as the courtyard had been, of statues. The one nearest the door was a little fawn with a very sad expression on its face, and Edmund couldn't help wondering if this might be Lucy's friend. The only light came from a single lamp, and close beside this sat the White Witch. "I am come, Your Majesty," said Edmund, rushing eagerly forward. "How dare you come alone?" said the witch in a terrible voice. Did I not tell you to bring the others with you? Please, Your Majesty, said Edmund. I have done the best I can. I've brought them quite close. They're in the little house on top of the dam just up the river with Mr. and Mrs. Beaver. A slow, cruel smile came over the witch's face. Is this all your news? She asked. No, Your Majesty, said Edmund, and proceeded to tell her all he had heard before leaving the beaver's house. What? Aslan? Cried the queen. Aslan, is this true? If I find you have lied to me? Please, please, I'm only repeating what they said, stammered Edmund. But the queen, who was no longer attending to him, clapped her hands. Instantly, the same dwarf whom Edmund had seen with her before appeared. Make ready our sledge, ordered the witch. Use the harness without bells.